how are you complicit in creating the conditions you say you don't want? That question is so grounding and it's so powerful for me because it demands honesty, but it also implies agency.
I'm your host, Sha Hurley. Each week, I invite a conscious leader in tech, sales, and beyond to share their inner journey, how they overcome obstacles, how they achieve success while staying true to themselves, and above all, what makes them human beings. I hope those authentic conversations serve as an inspiration for you as you continue your own inner journey of self-discovery, healing, and mastery. Hi, Camilo. Welcome to the show. I'm super excited for our conversation today. I know we're going to talk about something, I don't want to say dark, I don't want to say heavy, but something we might experience in this lifetime, or if some of us have actually experienced it in the past. And something that comes sometimes unexpectedly, and we just needed to know how to work with that. So before we dive right in, we'll have you to just introduce yourself, maybe not in the traditional way, in a way that makes you feel like just so unique, you, Camilo. So
Sure.
But don't tell us your whole life story. We don't have time for that.
No worries. Very quickly, this is integral. I was born in Bogota, Colombia, but I moved to the US when I was 11. So I'm kind of from both sides and I carry those identities within me. Until very recently, I was working in tech sales, but I just started taking essentially what is going to be a year-long sabbatical where I'm going to be doubling down on some of my passions like writing and also exploring other creative endeavors. So I think in 30 seconds, that captures pretty succinctly where I've been and where I'm going.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. It's perfect. That's perfect. Because I know that the way how we nerd how to do an elevator pitch is definitely not this kind of version, right? You kind of need to put your value proposition, whatever included. And then I'm so glad you're not thinking about that, because I think that's kind of, that allows me to know more about you as who you are and Camilo from Colombia. And we chatted, I think we used to work together, and then the version of you that I'm aware of is that version of you that's super happy, content. I don't want to say happy, because I remember the time when you and I chatted, I was like, well, Camilo, are you happy? And you're like, I'm content. And so why don't we start from there? Like, what's your definition of being happy and being content? And you always put this philosophical lenses on different things. So I think this conversation is going to be super interesting.
I don't recall exactly what year we had. I mean, we've known each other for, many years at this point.
Yes.
Obviously, like our lines have converged and diverged, different cities, different roles. But I think the way I think about happiness versus contentment, or both of those ideas today, I almost feel like happiness needs to be rebranded or relabeled to joy, because a lot of people think of happiness as the emotion. But for me, it's more intuitive to think of joy as the emotion, right? The euphoria, the dopamine rush, you don't have to explain what joy feels like, hopefully. Like, I think if I tell, whoever's listening to this joy, they're like, yes, I know what that feels like. Whereas I think contentment has to do a lot more with the idea of acceptance and equanimity, because for me, contentment or being content is a sustained state. If it's a sustained state, that means that you're going to have to deal with things outside of your control, positive and negative events. And I mean, we're adding those value judgments to the events in the first place. So I think that that's the distinction I would make, because I think if we don't make that distinction, then we end up coming into this hedonistic treadmill where you just want more happiness, because you feel like that's what you need to stay content. Whereas I think acceptance is going to be a much more even-keeled approach to what life throws at us.
Wow. Yeah, that got me to think about things differently, because I used to think happiness is transitory, where you don't feel it all the time. It depends on external situation. And like you were saying, we value things differently. We add different storylines, narratives to the situation that's happening. And then that causes this kind of transitory state of being or mood. And contentment, to me, the time that when you and I chatted years back then, my understanding was this kind of like satisfactory. Like, and I'm satisfied with this. So that's more internal to me, because it's more stable.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then you're talking about dealing with the different situations. Now I'm personally being impacted by the layoff. I'm so familiar with that kind of difficult situation that's coming from outside and outside of our control too. And I'm trying to understand what contentment means. One word rushed to my mind is tolerance. So what's your take on that? You know, is contentment really something that we needed to tolerate for us to reach that stage? I'm trying to understand and if you are irrelevant, that's okay too.
No. Because I think the way you are thinking about happiness and contentment has to do more of, you know, the whole idea of locus of control, right? Or happiness, maybe like you get a compliment or like you get a prize or something, and then you feel. But to me, like, in my brain, the way I process that is like, oh, I felt joy. Something that happened outside of my conscience brought me joy. I think the way I think about contentment is not necessarily tolerance, because, and now we might be getting into semantics, but I think acceptance is for me, it's a word that better fits, you know, how I think about contentment, because tolerance means like you're putting up with something, so that the tension's still there. And I think true acceptance is when you observe the tension or you know, that thing that you're holding on to, but you don't necessarily react to it. You just observe it, right? And obviously, like, super easy to say, you know, we can talk about that and like be like, oh yeah, we should be practicing acceptance. But that's like the daily work, right? It's building that emotional resiliency. But I think if you learn to accept the circumstances in your life and not immediately react and assign value judgments, doesn't mean they don't hurt, or doesn't mean they are not like joyful in the moment. But if we like keep hanging on to that, then I don't see a path of being content, because you're always going to be moved. And I think this is where we can intersect that with your idea of kind of like the locus of control. The exterior stimuli are always going to pull us whichever way they want, if we don't have a way to process those events and observe those events without attaching an outcome or a value judgment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think I would love to dive a little bit deeper or double click on some of the stuff that you just mentioned. I love how you're talking about the differences between tolerance and acceptance. I think what I observe in myself or people around me is that oftentimes people are not aware that they're tolerant in it. So in another word, a lot of us could be in a delusional space, thinking I'm moving on, I'm accepting this. But in fact, there's a lot of tolerance which has been built up deep inside of us, and that can kind of push us to a depressed state. That's my understanding. That's how I feel like sometimes things just progressing away, and we might think, how do I just get depressed? But to me, it's like because we bury our head in the sandbox, not really allowing ourselves to see how much tolerance has been there, that we're not facing it, right? And so I wanted to hear your thoughts, maybe like, you know, even real life stories that you experienced yourself, to identify how you knew that you're actually fully accepting this, or how you know that I'm just tolerating this. I think your story and Google and even other companies might help me and audience to understand a little bit deeper on the differences.
Yeah, I was nodding hard as you were saying that, because I think that's kind of why I got to the point where I became depressed, because to your point, I was tolerating a lot of things that really in my heart of hearts, I didn't want to tolerate. But, you know, through social programming, expectations, lack of awareness, the rhythm of the day-to-day, it kind of mutes and silences any signal that our body gives us that we shouldn't be tolerating our circumstances. And I think because frankly, I just didn't have that bodily intuition and that level of self-awareness to say like, okay, this is going down like a not so good path. I think I did get caught up in becoming depressed. And I mean, there's no shame for me in thinking like, oh, I let it get to that point. One, because it's already happened. Like,
right,
I can't change that. but two, because I think it's just really normal, especially in the society that we live in, that like we just add so many layers, like so many. I mean, we have the idea of social masks, but I think the social masks are not only social masks, but also like layers that prevent us from really listening to our intuition and really building a constant deep level of self-awareness. And, had I, again, no shame in how it played out, but had I had that higher awareness, I would have been able to alter the circumstances that led me to get into a depressed state. Because I only noticed it once my body was like rebelling against me. I mean, once I realized that I had little energy to do anything for like long enough of a period, but I was still sleeping, 8 hours a day, eating well. I'm not a big drinker. So like you kind of did process of eliminations, like, okay, like the things that usually make people tired, I'm taking care of those. So like what's wrong? And it was my body basically saying like, you need to change. Right. And when I talk about my depression, what I tell people is it became something I needed to act on when my discontent with my circumstances at work and in my life became more than just like an existential problem, and it started becoming a health problem. And that's what happens when you just kind of let depression run rampant, because you just don't feel it. It just kind of just, I mean, I think, maybe people might have different experiences with depression, but for me, just kind of like creeped in, and then I felt like one way, and I didn't realize I was feeling one way until it was kind of late. And then it was kind of like doing the work to like untangle that, for me at least.
Yeah, this is so interesting. You're talking about how you feel the bodily sensations, and you're almost describing this. I think what I learned, a new word I learned is high functioning depression, because you're functioning, right? You're working.
Yeah.
And it's interesting also you mentioned about how my body was rebellious against me. It's almost like the body is not part of you. It's like something else. It's like the words I'm just kind of using your real words. When you say your body was rebellious against you, what do you mean by you?
That's a good question. I think my body was rebelling against the side of me that thought there's nothing wrong, or that even if there's anything wrong, I could just overcome it by thinking it away, by saying like, oh, I'm feeling bad. Like, well, just hang on, be greedy. I think grit has a lot of value as an idea, but I think it's very often misapplied in our society, especially, in the environments that you and I have been in, which are like high pressure, tech, a lot of expectations, because there's a lot of rewards, frankly. So the idea of like, oh, just overcome the obstacles, you can do anything type of thing. I think my body was rebelling against that. Like, no, like you need to take a step back and really start changing things because I'm suffering type of thing.
Let us talk about grade a little bit more. It's interesting that you're saying you're framing that as grade, because in my mind, it's just like, we're trying to achieve more. And as you were describing that, unfolding that, your thought process, which is so beautiful, I often thought about that as just like, hey, we're just all trying to get external validation, whether it's in a corporate rewarding system, trying to get another promo, or trying to get a peer bonus, trying to get a manager saying, hey, Sha or Camilo, you're doing a great job, or giving you the project you always wanted, because that makes you feel like I'm doing a good job and then I deserve this new high priority project. But when you're saying that, you're framing that as a grade, I wanted to kind of like, maybe let's talk a little bit more on that. Where do you think that's coming from? Maybe your own stories, your background, and why did it exist?
Why did my grit exist?
Yeah, for you. I'm curious. Anything that you're comfortable sharing?
Yeah. As I kind of listen to you kind of retell some of the things that, generally motivate people, especially in corporate workplaces. For me, it wasn't really none of that. Like, if obviously, like, it's always a good feeling that, like, if your manager praises you, if you get promoted, like, these things are nice. But for me, and I think this ties to the idea of grit, it was just, am I doing my best work? Am I doing the work that I'm proud of? And am I being given the agency and liberty to work in the best way that I think I can bring in results? And where grit comes in is because that's all tied, as much as I've been able to kind of make the connection, that's all tied to like perfectionist tendencies. But for me, like my grit was manifesting as like, I have to uphold these perfectionist tendencies. I have to be able to do my best work all the time and overcome any obstacle that gets in the way of making my best work within the environment that I'm doing this work in. So it kind of fixated me on trying to push through to sustain that perfectionist standard that I have, versus saying, well, am I even in the right environment? Am I even in the right game for me to feel fulfilled and do work that I like? The way grit manifested for me was like, oh, just push through, because you need to maintain that standard that you hold for yourself. Like that's something throughout my life I've always struggled with, is like that perfectionist standard. Like everything I do has to be the best and excellent, and like that's the internal monologue. So I think that's kind of what grit meant for me, was you gotta sustain that standard no matter what. No matter if your body is breaking down, no matter if all these adverse events are against you. Where, once I started gaining the awareness that I did have depression and that it was time for a change, then it became more about asking myself deeper questions, which is like, yeah, am I in the right game? Are there other ways to see life? All these types of more existential questions, which even internally could be interpreted as an attack against my high standards. But fortunately, I come to a place where they're more of a reframe about the idea of perfectionism actually not being that healthy at all, and me being able to do really profound, meaningful work in whatever thing I do without having to aim for perfection.
The high standard, which I'm so familiar with, I had to actually work on that for myself too. And I do feel like Google probably did hired the right people, because we're just so self-driven, and because I see that just this situation we're just talking about is just not between you and I. We all share this with a lot of our peers and friends and managers and even higher level leaders at Google and other tech companies. I wonder for you where that's coming from. Like, if you remember the first time you had this self-awareness, I knew that I had a high standard for myself. If you can date all the way back to earlier stage of life.
Yeah, it's a good question. To be frank, I can't pinpoint to a moment where I realized I had the high standards. What I think gave me that awareness that I had high standards, but that it may be operating in a non-productive way for me, was through friends and even coworkers. They saw my internal dialogue. They saw how hard I was being on myself, right? They saw, let's say I did something great, but they would hear me say like, I could have done better. Or like, I missed the mark on this. And then they're like, what are you talking about? Like, this was like excellent. And I'm like, yeah, thank you. You're just being nice. And is that like active? Yeah. I mean, I'm sure I've said something like that to you, and you kind of gave me that response where like, oh, it could have been better. But it was kind of noticing that people were basically calling me out on not giving myself enough credit consistently over time. I think I started, and obviously through like reading, books, self-help and all that, and understanding the role of awareness in introspection and the overall benefits to ourselves, I kind of started seeing like, oh, okay, yeah, this dialogue is part of this yearning for perfection in everything I do, and rarely has it served me well. So I should probably try to not do it, which again, easier said than done. I still struggle with this every day, but fortunately now I know that that's like a key thing that I need to undo in all facets of my life, because it touches everything, not just professionally, the way I manage my relationships. Like I have to have the best friendships. I have to have the best romantic relationships. I have to have the best small talk at the coffee shop. Like dude, like it's just not sustainable.
Oh my God, this is such a fascinating topic, and then also just seeing you come to this realization. like I said, we don't talk on a daily basis. So every time we talk, it's been like a few years. And then I'm like, wow, this is a new version of Camilo I'm learning. And this is amazing too. Because I do remember the time when we actually worked together, and then you were always like on top of things and doing amazing things. I do even remember sometimes I would say nice things to you, and then you would like, the way how you handle those conversations, like, yeah, you're just being nice, it's fine, I can always do better. And then I remember those, stuff, and then just it's interesting because I also see myself in similar situations. It's almost like I'm not able to take on any compliments on the surface, but it's like deep inside of me, there's a lot of self-criticism, like, I can always do better. And then I frame it as a way of I'm just a learner. I'm always wanting to learn new things. So I criticize myself so I can learn how to get better. But how healthy is that? As you're just sharing your experiences, I start to kind of reflect how I share a similar journey as you do too. And I think a lot of us share a similar journey as well, the inner journey. Yeah, and you're talking about you want the best things possible. I was thinking like you travel. I saw that you recently started to travel a lot for your sabbatical leave. And in my head, I'm like, well, the question is, do you always get first class? Because that's the best on the plane, right? Or do you like settle for any economic setting on the plane?
Yeah. No, fortunately for some of these things, I'm more pragmatic.
So like, how do you decide which version of Camilo you bring into certain situation?
Yeah, that's a great question because, I mean, even though I do know that I do have a strong yearning for being a perfectionist, I do think I made a lot of progress in not letting that all seep constantly in all areas of my life. So when I'm traveling, I'm more of like, I'm more pragmatic, like, and for me, I get less enjoyment out of luxury. Like for me, I don't have to stay in, the Ritz-Carlton. I don't have to fly business. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't mind flying business, and I've flown business and it's great, but like, it's not a make or break for me. Whereas to others, like, oh no, I'm not flying across the Atlantic if it's not business. For me, it's more like, how can I put myself in a position where I can immerse myself and be present in the place that I am, be economically sensible, right? Not cheap, but like economically sensible, but also give myself space to just wander. And I do think that has come about. I mean, I've traveled, I mainly travel solo. I've traveled, for many, many years. I felt like that's one area in my life where maybe I kind of just let go, because travel will teach you really quickly, especially you're traveling by yourself, that you try to plan everything, you're just going to get punched in the mouth, and then you don't have a plan. So I think that's one of those areas where maybe my perfectionist tendencies kind of diluted or dissolved, because life just very clearly told me, like, yeah, those rules, those inclinations are not gonna work here. Otherwise, you're gonna end up hating traveling. So I think that's one of the, interestingly enough, as we're coming in this conversation, I think that's one of those areas in my life where I kind of learned to let go more so than in other areas of my life. So yeah.
Let's talk about humanity. What do you think makes us human being from your perspective?
It's funny because I think, I mean, I've thought about this question throughout my life, not like intensely, right? I'm not going to pretend that like, I do have.
I'm not surprised. You're like philosopher's mind, right? Like the philosophers sit there thinking about the word and themselves, and I'm not surprised, but go on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess thankfully I didn't study philosophy, because it probably would have been hard to get a job, but not that matters now anyways. But I think 10 years ago, the answer to that question, I would have compared, okay, what makes us human, by thinking about what makes us different than animals, than mammals, reptiles, etc., or even other like fungi, for instance, other parts of the animal kingdom, of the
chain, the food chain.
The food chain, yeah.
We're at top of it for now.
Yeah. And it would have been along the lines of like, well, our ability to collaborate more intrinsically, because, animals do collaborate, right? But for us, like, what distinguishes us is our ability to create and use language to create abstract meanings. I mean, I think our ability as humans to create metaphors is what makes us distinctly human, because you are creating associations, and those associations carry new meaning and those perdure. And I mean, people that know me know I geek out on metaphors because I could talk about it all day, but like they're so deeply rooted in how culture and language is developed that, in my opinion, I'm like, oh, that's what makes us human. But now, thinking that question today, like, okay, what makes us humans? Our ability to reason, to tell stories, to craft metaphors. Well, with some of the large language models that exist out there, they can pretty much do all of that, right? You can ask ChatGPT, write me a compelling story that makes me cry or something like that, and like, it will write words that could drive you to that point. So now, like, what is my answer then, right? To like what makes us human? I think it's to the last point that I was talking about when I talked about taking photos, is the ability to feel both tremendous wonder, joy, awe, surprise, tremendous disappointment, frustration, grief, sorrow. And that's why even, when I was, going through a dark period, part of me always recognized the gift it was to feel heavy, bad, dark emotions. I mean, depression is a bit differently, because depression, at least the way it manifested for me, was like not even feeling joy, but not even feeling sadness. It was just like that kind of numb state, which for me is kind of like what messed me up, because I don't necessarily mind being sad. Obviously, I don't like being sad like long time, right? But I can appreciate heartbreak. I can appreciate grief when I step out and say, okay, well, this is part of the human experience. This is part of what makes us uniquely human. Even if I don't like what is making me sad, I should at least recognize that it's a privilege to have this feeling. So I think that would be my answer today, especially as, we're talking about AI and how quickly it's advanced.
Yeah.
I don't know if an AI model could genuinely feel joy or sorrow. I think they can just learn to express what they think somebody might receive that, and they just can't feel it. So I think that's probably my best answer at this point.
Yeah, we can definitely go on down the path and then trying to analyze and what's going on, especially given that you and I both worked in cloud for a while, bringing us back to the connection of this topic to depression. I love how you're talking about how what depression got you was you didn't feel anything at all. It was numbness. Yeah. And when I was a child, I was like, I wanted to test all different kind of emotions. I want happiness, I want anger, and all the different kind of things. Even when I got married, and I remember the day when my husband and I got married, I was like, well, let's get ready for ups and downs and highs and lows, and then ready for all those like low emotions. And I guess universe just give us a lot of high, ups and downs and ups and downs. I'm like, whoa, shoot, I didn't expect there's so many lows, but I at some point was actually addicted to those lows, because there's so much richness in those lows, those low moments, the sadness and anger. You can learn so much about yourself and about the people around you and the world in those moments. And there's a period of time I was so addicted. It's almost like I intentionally create situations, stories to get me in that state. But let's talk about the numbness that when you feel.
Can I ask you a question first? Because I think you said something really interesting that just triggered something that I heard you. So you mentioned that you kind of got addicted to these low feelings because the way you saw it was that you saw lessons in that. And then I remember like earlier in our conversation, you were talking that part of your perfectionist tendencies were to kind of downplay or find a flaw because you always wanted to have that desire to learn. So it seems to me like I'm just sensing like the patterns, like for you, like this is really interesting because it's like you're taking any negative experience or input as an opportunity to learn, which if you just take that sentence, that's not a bad thing, right? That like when you think of people that like really resilient and, courageous and have awareness, they're like, oh, they know how to turn the bad into positive. Like that's like the common saying. But it seems like it got to a point where it wasn't serving you. So like, I guess, is it because like that was your like predominant mindset and that clouded everything else? Or like how did it, I guess I'm trying to figure out like, how did it stop serving you?
Okay, so this is the reason why I love talking to you. Well, my ego was like, how dare you, Camilo, sitting there analyzing me, but then if I put my ego aside, right, like, hey, you're actually helping me to reflect, go inside of myself a little bit more that I normally would not touch with my ego entangled in the way how I think about things, right? So so the belief system I had growing up, I think it's kind of some of the Chinese people or Asian people, I don't know about you, I think it's a Latin culture similar to Chinese culture in a way, more family oriented and then
Yes.
blah, blah, blah. And then so grow up, I was very close with my parents. And my parents always, I think, also my mom, it was a tiger mom, right? She always wanted me to be the best. So the belief system I unconsciously took it from her was I needed to just I needed to just get best out of everything. Even the time when my parents went through divorce, even the time that I was in boarding school in the age of 7, I always talk to people. I never get to be a kid because I had to grow up quickly and I had to really handle my own emotions. At the age of 7, whereas, my parents are doing their own thing and I need to make sure I can handle myself so they didn't have to worry about me. So I think the tendency, the pattern that you're talking about, that was developed since I was a child, and I was so unconscious. I think it's a protection mechanism. I just wanted to, one way to protect myself and one way is to protect our little family and make sure they're okay. But somehow, as I get older in the workspace and I still show up in that way that I was not even aware, to a point, and I realized, I think it's one of my spiritual teacher, and he said, Sha, like, do not glorify suffering. And that's where I started to think, wow, for years, I glorify suffering to a point I created suffering in my own life. And then I sometimes judge people who are just happy. I'm like, this person.
Yeah.
I remember the time when you and I were in Boston and then you're like, you remember the time we're in Uber and trying to go to our team events and the people just partying happy on the street. And that was like Monday night or something. I think you made a comment. It's like, yeah, find a job. And in my mind, I was thinking the same. I was like, how do people just being so happy and mindless, apparently I overthink things a lot, but I don't know if I answered your question, but it's like long-winded.
No, I think you got to the root of it, which I think there's truth in there for me as well. And again, we have to draw the nuance. It's not like our parents were like that out of malice, right? It was their way of saying like, this is how we think you're going to survive best in the world. But it really is up to us, when we're older, our age, is to be like, okay, what served me from that and what's not working anymore, and kind of like evolve from that. So it's funny because I think some of your upbringing also resonated with me. And I think the standards I was passed down it was really an act of love. And honestly, like, it wasn't even like my mom and, my dad when I was younger and my brother when I was kind of in my teenage years, I really don't remember a moment where they're like, you really have to be the best. And, I was never like talked to like there were drill sergeants and I was in the military. It was never that. It was more like, just do your best, like take pride in what you do. But maybe by virtue of how we grew up in the US, which was with limited resources and maybe absorbing things from society that I took a certain way, I put a lot of these standards that, to your point, ultimately created more suffering than that was necessary. And I mean, I want to draw really quick the distinctions. Like, it's not that high standards that they don't have a positive quality. Like, I don't think you and I are saying like don't have high standards. I think it's learning to have the awareness of when your expectations are setting you up for failure, especially if they're tied to an exterior stimuli. Whereas you can have an ambition or a desire that is then sustained by how you approach your work, by being consistent, by being passionate, by being intentional. That took me a really long time to make that distinction and kind of reframe the thoughts I had around like having high standards versus creating unnecessary suffering, which I think humans are extremely adept at doing that, as you and I have both discussed here.
Yeah, I think having high standards not a bad thing. We always wanted to get better, right? Like even talking about this conversation, or people who are listening might even share the similar motivation if I want to feel better. You're talking about moving from a place where you feel numbness and to pursue your own passion projects, feel more alive inside of you. I think it's in our definition of we're trying to get to a better place. So I think it's a way, how do we define higher standard? If the higher standard that we put in out there, it's not for our own happiness or for the world to be a better place, what's the whole point, right? Because in the corporate world, we can keep saying we have more revenue, more this, more that, and that's, to your point, agreed, right? And then for what, So that's a deeper question. I think we need to kind of understand the intention of the high standard.
Yeah.
And there's also, if you can dive deeper on that, there's also control, okay, we have this standard. How much control do we want to have in terms of the outcome? Because that outcome is out of our control. Because I do notice years ago when I was trying to work on deals, and then I noticed when I had a high standard and I tried to control how the thing was supposed to go, I show up as a jerk, excuse my language, and I sometimes can make communication could come out in a way that can hurt other people's feelings that I was not even aware of in the moment.
Yeah.
I literally last year I had to write down a list of people that I needed to apologize to. Seriously, I'm not joking. I was so unconscious in a certain period of my life in corporate because I just wanted to climb the ladder or do better and get whatever reason that was behind it. But when I did it in such an unconscious way, it didn't make me feel well. I didn't like myself. So I'm curious, your depression, it sounds like you're okay with anger. You're okay with dealing with sadness, and then you're okay with all the other emotions. Numbness is not one of them. If you could describe how you feel, how you come to your realization and you get out of this. I mean, you and I are weird people I knew that are okay with that sadness and anger. Normally people don't even like those emotions.
Yeah. Is your question how did I arrive at feeling okay about this emotions that people generally avoid?
Yeah, and then the follow-up is, how did you come to a realization that you're not okay with being numb?
Okay.
There are a lot of people in corporate, I can sense, I was walking zombie for years. High functioning walking zombie, right?
Okay, I'll make a distinction because I think once I make the distinction, it'll make more sense. On the first part of the question, honestly, I think I just romanticize everything. I mean, that's part of my nature. I tend to romanticize everything, and who knows how much of that is genetic? Who knows how much of that is being part of Latin culture and watching novelas when I was a kid and all that. I mean, at this point, I just know that that's a very strong tendency I have to romanticize everything. So even sadness and heartbreak and sorrow, I romanticize. Anger, less so. Anger is one of the emotions that I tend to be less comfortable with, even though I am aware that it will happen. But again, growing up in Colombia, where I saw the consequences of intolerance, anger, and violence, I'm more averse just because of that context, right? But I think it's because I romanticize the importance of feeling as a way to really honor our humanity. And for me, it really goes back to the idea well, what's the point of honoring your humanity? Well, that means that you're living with intention. And that means that you're showing up to your life and acknowledging that you have the privilege of living. Because it could end tomorrow for anybody, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the way to and again, there are days where I nail this, there are days where I don't. It is what it is. But that's the whole point of living with intention is so that you honor the fact that you get life one day at a time, or at one moment at a time. We're being really splitting hairs here. And part of living with that intention is letting the emotions flow and not shutting them down, not numbing them, which, to get to that part of the question, I think when I felt depression and the numbness I felt, it's a bit different than maybe the idea of numbness when you're in the day-to-day, which I guess might be very similar. But for me, the numbness of the day-to-day, when you're not necessarily in a depressed state, but you don't have awareness of your feelings, or you're observing your feelings, but then maybe you're reacting too much, and therefore creating excessive suffering, unnecessary suffering. I think that's just the virtue of the society we're in, where we're in society today, like at least in the US, right? Because that's the main context. It doesn't really invite self-reflection. It doesn't invite pausing. It doesn't invite saying like checking in with yourself, right? So that's kind of how you can quote unquote numb yourself to like really the things that are seeping through. But what I was talking about is in that depressive state, like it was just really hard for me to feel or think about like a time I was happy, or even like the sadness was muted. And that was like, why is it muted? Like I just felt like sadness for a little bit, and then just like, I wasn't feeling anything. And maybe they're like the same thing, but for me, I think there's something that makes them different in my mind. And to be honest, I haven't arrived at that, what that something is. I think it's a great question, but I think that's kind of what created a slight vicious cycle when I was in a depressed state, was that since feeling all the feelings is so important to me, not being able to feel all those feelings meant like, oh, are you not living life intentionally then? Are you an autopilot? Like who's in control here now type of thing. And I think that's
yourself.
Yeah. And I think that's what made it so bewildering. But I think the last part of your question was kind of like how I got out of it, right?
Sure, yeah. But before that, I wanted to kind of give it back to you, because I think you touch a point which is so valid in the corporate world. If you just right before we start recording, you and I talking about how our calendar is open now. It's not like when we're still on Google, our back-to-back meetings since morning and night, and there's no break in between. Even there's a break, it's for a quick bio break, quick lunch bite. And
bio break, which it's such a terrible name, but like, exactly. Yeah, you have to justify like that you have bodily needs. Oh, biological. My break has to be physically biological, not mental.
Exactly. Like that's urgent, right? Because bio break, it's like you have to do it, but like it's almost like emotions and all that stuff, feelings are the time for us to pause and feel it. It's unnecessary. It's not part of the must have. So
yeah.
And when you're saying that your emotions were muted in a way, I almost envision you, Camilo, were surrounded by barriers and walls. You're pushing away some of the kind of emotions and colorful emotions and are coming on your way. You're just like, no, another time. I have other high priority stuff, which might be deals and emails and other stuff. And long enough, and you're just like, almost like, leaving this little wall that you built for yourself. And I'm sharing this because I feel the same thing back then when I was depressed. And I didn't know. Now you're talking about this, like, well, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But I think there are also a lot of people still fighting the battle in the corporate world and dealing with a similar situation, might not even know that they're depressed. They're still trying to get the next email answered, the next deal down, So I think it's super important that what you just shared.
And to your point, like, I need to think about this more, but like the idea of compartmentalizing things, like putting, I had a manager who's like, you gotta be able to like compartmentalize things. I hate that word because it's so hard to pronounce, but I think people know what I mean.
There are a lot of
put things in compartments. Just pretend that's what
I get it.
Yeah. My manager was coaching me that like that this is a thing I needed to do to be less reactive, to get less frustrated. When I any issue I got at work, any interpersonal issue I had at work was because I felt like people weren't pulling their weight, and I let them know, right? And sometimes that can be a very aggressive approach. And then they're like, my manager's like, oh, you need to put this in compartments. And I always kind of listen and I try to absorb it, but I'm like, today, like, to me, I don't know if that's the right thing to do. I don't know if by saying like, oh, you need to put things into compartments, we're creating the types of layers or the types of numbness that prevents people from realizing that, their circumstances are not ideal and that they need to take action. So I feel like that's a bit of a common wisdom in the corporate world that, again, I'll be happy to, reconsider my position and see the virtue of compartmentalization. But today, Camilo today is just like, I just don't get it. I don't think that's healthy.
I think this conversation marks this version of you, and we all evolve, we all process our thoughts. So yeah, of course it's going to change. And I know what you're talking about. I clearly remember there's a time I was in a meeting and apparently triggered by a lot of people. It's a group meeting. I think in meetings we can easily get triggered by other people's way of showing up. And I was so triggered. And my husband came to you, and there was a time during pandemic, and we both worked from home, and he came to me and he talked to me for something. I don't even remember what he said. I just remember I was so angry and I yelled at him. And then in my mind, I was like, I needed to stay calm. I need to put on this, calm, peaceful version of me, like that version of Sha, to get the meeting done. And then I'll have the conversation with my husband later on. But the reality was I was suppressing whatever emotions. So it's a mix of so many different emotions in that meeting, and I didn't feel well. My chest, so much heaviness in there. My back hurts, my neck hurts. And on Friday, my husband and I went for a Friday night date night, right? Like, he was like, you told me that you want to talk. What are you angry at that time? You're yelling at me. And I'm like, I don't remember. I really don't remember. And we didn't really go dive deeper into what really happened. I think what happened is like we sometimes feel like we have this Superman memory. We remember everything and we can talk about it whenever we want it. We can process our emotion whenever we want it. But it doesn't really work that way.
No.
So little by little, I suppress a lot of my emotions. And people always say, Sha, you're so peaceful, you're so calm, right? But really, like, if you ask my husband, he will be like, are you really describing Sha or someone else? So that's for the longest time I was, suppressing. And then I think that's like now learning about your story and got me to reflect. I think that's what got me to be really depressed at some point. But yours, I think it's like the more I learn about your story, your thought process, it's almost like there's part of you just wanted to express your creative energy that you are not able to in the tech corporate world, and then also the emotions, which is interesting because I feel like in the corporate world, and we're talking about, let's just be professional. Let's get the things done. But what does it mean being professional? Does that mean not bringing emotions to the conversation?
Yeah.
Does that mean we don't talk about anything that's non-human related, or just whatever that's only relevant to the outcome, the ideal outcome of the task? And that's something I'm trying to understand, because especially for now, I think there are a lot of people trying to decide if they want to stay in the tech company that they work at, or pursue a passion project, which is what you're going to do, or jump to another tech company and trying to find a different culture. I know grass is not really greener on the other side, right? But how did you come to the realization or decision that you wanted to take a break and pursue a passion project that takes a lot of courage?
Yeah, it goes back to what I was saying earlier in our conversation, where once I determined that how I felt, it was a mix of depression, anxiety, and burnout, all just rolled up into one nice little ball inside of me. Once I realized that I wasn't dealing with a, like in terms of like Maslow's hierarchy, like a self-actualization issue, but it was like a health issue, right? Like my body was feeling constantly tired, anxious, just not sleeping well, a bunch of other things that the body was like, stop. I decided to like get help, right? And, see a therapist, which I kind of had been putting off for a while. When I moved away from Austin, I had to change therapists and all that. So that's kind of how I realized, like, okay, I need to at least take a break from this environment. I need to get to a baseline. I don't say it like, oh, I needed to be the Camilo that was before depression. It was more like, I need to be something that I can recognize, because right now I'm not recognizing myself, right? I was very cynical, very like short-tempered, pessimistic, not very energetic. I wasn't making jokes. Like, honestly, like for me, the biggest barometer was like, I'm not as funny anymore. What the hell happened? And once I kind of caught those signs, I'm like, okay, I need to take a break. But now the second piece is through how I decided to not only take a break, but like pivot to a completely wild and uncertain direction. I think it was the accumulation of, so basically, I got to give a little bit of context. So I've done writing in some form or another since, I don't know, I was like 14, 15. Like I wrote poems, and then like I remember in the MySpace days, I used to like write notes. I forget what it was called, but like it was like I remember like I wrote about like the World Cup in 2006. I was like 16. In college, I had a blog. It's funny, like with my best friend, we had a podcast before like that was a thing. So I realized like all my life I've kind of been doing a lot of like these creative things, especially around writing. And then for most of my professional career, I kind of just put that away as if it wasn't fully compatible. It was around the pandemic time, in late 2020, early 2021, where I realized that like, oh, maybe I need to write again. And like I wrote and self-published like an ebook. And that was really with the approach of like, what would I do if I knew I was going to fail, right? A lot of people think of the stereotypical question of what would you do if you knew you wouldn't fail? Mm-hmm. No, it was like, what would you do if you knew you were going to fail? So I'm like, well, I'll write a book because like if nobody reads it, nobody dies. So like, no harm, no foul. And doing that experiment and seeing the reception that, mainly I got from my friends, because I didn't really do marketing, right? I just shared it with like my networks. That made me realize like, oh, there's something there. So then I started, writing a little bit, and then I enrolled in a course called like Rite of Passage. It's like online based. And that kind of got my writing juices flowing. And, I put up a website, started publishing essays. So even while I was working and, my situation at work was slowly deteriorating over the years, coming to, the climax, the last half of 2022, in parallel, my writing practice was kind of in ascension. And it made me realize that I had a strong, artistically creative side of me that I had repressed for a long time. And once it kind of hit like the lines intersected, the deterioration in my work was so vivid, right? The whole depression and everything. But I was going in like this creative ascent and discovery. I was like, well, like this gives me energy, right? My creative endeavors. My work is not giving me energy. So I need to change things, right? And obviously it's a very scary situation. I mean, that's a broader conversation of like, how I managed through it. The one tip or thing that was like really impactful for me is like I just journaled like what the fears were. Like, okay, like what's the fear? That I'm gonna have a career again, that I'm gonna be broke, that I'm gonna be homeless, that blah blah blah, that my family will reject me, etc. And like I kind of wrote down like, okay, how realistic is that, right? Like give it a percentage, like 10%, 100%. And if it was like a high risk, like of quote unquote being, like for instance being broke, then like, okay, how do you mitigate it? But just going through that, it's like a fear audit or fear journaling. Tim Ferriss has a guide somewhere on the internet about this, so people can check it out. But once I kind of did that work, it was really useful because one, I named the fears. Two, I assigned them more accurate weights, I put them on paper. And three, it allowed me to figure out like, oh, I could put mitigation plans in place. These fears are not that probable, but I have a strategy. So once I was able to kind of come to terms to that, then that's kind of how I was able to design a sabbatical around this. And, there are great folks online that I follow that have given me guidance, or directly or through their writing, that have informed like, okay, you can do a sabbatical. It will be probably good for your health, which was the main criteria, but it might also be good for finding a sense of fulfillment and purpose. And if it all, like what I tell people, like if like it goes terrible and like I don't gain any awareness or money or anything in this period, then I'll just get a job. I mean, it is what it is. So that once I kind of realized that the stakes were not life or death, really. And again, that's a privilege. Not everybody's in that position, right? But once I realized that it was not life or death for me, I'm like, I got to do this. It's now or never.
Yeah, I love your approach. It's almost a combination of a heart and mind and headspace, because you put your heart in the center, like what really give me energy, what makes me feel alive as a person, Camilo. And you're strategizing things, because I also love how you're just thinking about what's the worst that can happen, and then you don't stop there. A lot of people stop there and then they scare themselves to death and not taking actions. You actually assign weight on it. And then you actually come up with strategies and to mitigate whatever that could happen. So help you to move forward. I think that's super smart. And then based on our conversation, based on what I know about you, I doubt if you're going to have zero awareness based on the next mileage, because you're the kind of person who just always think about yourself, dive a little bit deeper. And so even for that, and then it's next mile, right? I think sometimes we create illusion in thinking, oh, wow, if I'm leaving and that means the rest of my life, it's going to be, there's lack of stability, there's this change and that change. But hey, we're really talking about next mile, not the whole rest of our life. So
yes,
yeah. And love that. And then you provided so many good tips that I even got me to think about a lot of things, because I'm also going through my own transitions.
You are.
There's could be a lot of fear-based thinking, scarcity-based thinking, but we're still young. I know you and I are both privileged in a way, no kid. But there are for people folks who have kids, they need to think about financial situation.
It's a different calculus for sure. I mean, I do think it can be, well, I caveat my words heavily because like easy for a person with no child to say what you can or cannot do with a child. But this is just based on my observations of people that taking unconventional paths or career pivots with families. It's like, it can be done. Is it harder than if you had less dependencies? Well, yeah, of course. But I also don't like when people put themselves in these like mind prisons without first challenging them, or even like doing a basic amount of research of like, has somebody done what I kind of want to do? And maybe it's very rare and maybe you punt on it. Fine, right? But like, I just feel like people don't even give the permission to themselves of being like, what would this look like if this was different? Or to your point, like not only naming like what the worst fear is, but really questioning it.
Yeah, and then it's interesting you're talking about, right, like with all the constraints or conditions, yes, it's harder, but how hard do you want a different kind of life? How important is health to you comparing to your current status? Because I think if we can be honest with ourselves, sometimes the reason we're not taking action, we're already making a decision by staying on where we are, right? Yeah. And then maybe there's some importance of whatever you already have that's like, don't lie with ourselves. Yeah. Right? Like we need to be honest with ourselves. I think suffering normally happens when we're just 1 foot in, 1 foot out.
Yeah.
We're half here, but half somewhere else, and thinking that different life and different kind of career, different path will be better, but we're not being present in our own life and enjoying every single moment. So it's a decision. Sometimes it seems it's hard to make, but it's really like at the spiritual level, we're really not making any decisions at all. So that concludes our conversation for today. Any last word you want to share with people who are in similar situation, whether they're dealing with fighting burned out, depression, or trying to just find the next mile to walk on that's more true to themselves? Yeah,
I mean, I would hope that people can start having just a little bit more radical honesty with their circumstances. I've arrived at that through having a semi-consistent journaling practice that's benefited me a lot. I know it's not going to be the cure-all for everybody, but I'm very bullish on a journaling practice being a great path into introspection. And one question that I always come back to, which is like really powerful, it's from a book called Reboot by an executive coach. His name is Jerry Colonna. Amazing books, written with so much heart. The question is, how are you complicit in creating the conditions you say you don't want? And that question is so grounding and it's so powerful for me because it just demands honesty, but it also implies agency because it's asking, how are you complicit?
Yes.
So it's not so that you can blame the world or blame other factors. Like, no, what's your role in the dissatisfaction you feel, basically? And I think once you can come to yourself with that question and face it honestly, right, not try to push it away, it will lead to some sort of productive action that is going to make you feel at least 1% better. So I guess that would be my tip.
I love that. I think it's reminds me of something I read too. The day that your life really starts is the day that when you start to take full responsibility of your own life, right? So And we are all doing that baby steps, so don't be too hard on ourselves. We're
Right.
not there yet. So,
Yes. That's a good note. Practice grace. Yeah.
yes, it's a part of being human being. And then I love this conversation so much, Camilo. Thank you so much for
This was great, Sha.
so vulnerable. And then I love authentic conversation, and I do think that's what makes us human being, the connection, the true connection. So, well, thank you again for sharing your voice on this podcast with the people, and hopefully it resonates with others. And then also, I do believe some of the wisdom that you shared will inspire other people on a similar journey, and we're all connected. So we'll stay connected as we always do.
Thank you, Sha. This was a lovely conversation.
Thanks for listening. If you are a conscious leader in tech, sales, and beyond, check out my free So Soundist community at shahharli.com/community. Sign up if you resonate with the message. And if you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe and share the show with your colleagues and friends. I'll see you next week.